So let's go over session management and cookies. A web session is a sequence of HTTP request and response transactions between a web client and a web server. Now you have things like the pre-authentication tasks, the actual authentication process, the session management, and then access control and session finalization. A lot of web applications keep track of information about each user for the duration of the web transactions. Now, several web applications have the ability to establish variables like access rights and the localization settings and many others. These variables apply to each and every interaction a user has with the web application for the duration of the session. Web applications can create sessions to keep track of anonymous users after the very first user request. For example, the application can remember the user language preference every time that it actually visits the site or application front end. Also, applications use sessions once the user has actually authenticated, and this actually allows the application to identify the user or any subsequent request, and also to be able to apply security access controls and also to increase the usability of the application. In short, web applications can provide session capabilities both before and also after authentication. Now, once an authenticated session has been established, the session ID or the token is temporarily equivalent to the strongest authentication method used by the application. This can be username and passwords, one-time passwords, client-based digital certificates, and others. Now, a good resource that provides a lot of information about application authentication is the OWASP authentication cheat sheet that I'm showing in the screen. In order to keep the authenticated state and track the user process, applications actually provide users with a session ID or a token. And this token is assigned at the session creation time and is shared and exchanged by the user and the web application for the duration of the session. The session ID is a name value pair. Now, session ID names used by the most common web application development frameworks can be easily fingerprinted. For example, you can easily identify PHP session ID in the case of PHP, or a J session ID in the case of J2EE, CFID, CF token in case of Cold Fusion, ASP.NET session ID in case of ASP.NET, and many others, right? So another things that you actually can see from the session ID name is probably what framework and programming languages are actually used by the web application. And this can actually be fairly valuable for you as a pen tester, or if you're actually just doing research on on an application, right? Now, it is recommended to change the default session ID name of the web development framework to a generic name, just like, just ID, right? For example. Now, the session ID must be long enough to prevent brute force attacks, and sometimes developers actually set it up to just a few bits. But at the end of the day, the session ID must be at least 128 bits or 16 bytes. Also, the session ID must be unique and unpredictable. This is why you need to use a good pseudo-random number generator, right? And the session ID value must provide at least 64 bits of entropy if you use a good pseudo-random number generator. Now, there are multiple mechanisms available in the HTTP transactions to maintain session state within web applications. Things like cookies, right, in the standard HTTP header, URL parameters and rewriting defined in RFC 2396, also URL arguments on GET request, and also developers use body arguments in post request, like hidden form fields in HTML forms or proprietary HTTP headers. But one of the most widely used and commonly used session ID exchange mechanisms are cookies. And this is because cookies offer an advanced capability not available in all the other methods that I mentioned. Now, one malpractice that you actually can take advantage of whenever you're doing a pen test is when the session ID is included in the URL. And this can lead to the manipulation of the ID itself or session fixation attacks. Now, web development frameworks like ASP.NET, PHP, Ruby on Rails, and many others provide their own session management features and associated implementations. And it is recommended that you use these built-in frameworks instead of building your own and building something from scratch, since they actually have been tested by many people in the community, but you often find people trying to create their own implementations in many environments whenever you're performing a pen test. So from an offensive security, of course, you can actually take advantage of that. From a defensive security, it's actually a malpractice. I will say, at least, is less consistent and may actually introduce several vulnerabilities, right? Now, another thing that I want to mention, and is extremely obvious, but is that you actually have to remember to encrypt the entire web session, not only for the authentication process when the actual user credentials are exchanged, but also to ensure that the session ID is only exchanged through an encrypted channel. Now, the usage of an encrypted communication channel also protects the session against some session fixation attacks. This is where the attacker is able to intercept and manipulate the web traffic to inject or quote unquote fix the session ID on the victim's web browser. Now, session management mechanisms, based on cookies, can make use of two types of cookies, either non-persistent or session cookies and persistent cookies. Now, if a cookie has the max age or the expire attributes present, it will be considered to be a persistent cookie, and it will be stored on disk by the web browser until the expiration time is achieved. Another note in here is actually that the max age attribute has preference over the expire attribute. Now, typically modern applications track users after authentication using non-persistent cookies. This actually forces the session information to be deleted from the client if the web server instance is actually closed. This is why it's important to use non-persistent cookies so that the session ID does not remain on the web client cache for long periods of time. Session IDs must be carefully validated and verified by the application. Now, depending on the session management mechanism that is actually used by the application, the session ID will be received in a GET or a POST parameter in the URL or in an HTTP header using cookies. If the web application actually does not validate and filter out the session ID values, they can potentially be exploited by many other vulnerabilities like SQL Injection if the session ID is actually stored in a relational database, or by persistent cross-site scripting if the session IDs are stored and reflected back afterwards by the web application.